Futures are rising on the first day of the trade when Biden isn't running for president in 2024. 30 minutes until the start of trading. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Sonali Basak.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
Coming up, an election reset. Vice President Kamala Harris began shoring up support for a White House run while Trump's campaign makes contingency plans.
As Democrats plot their next steps, we'll get reaction from Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin.
And muted markets, investors looking beyond Biden's exit, gearing up for a flood of earnings and key economic data this week. Let's take a look at where we stand. About 30 minutes until the opening bell. We are rising, actually, in futures. The S&P 500 currently up about 0.6%. You think about the volatility that we saw last week, not seeing it right now. Big tech up even more, up 1% pre-market on the NASDAQ 100. Treasury yields, meanwhile, a little bit of a rally in the bond market, currently down about 2 basis points, Matt.
Take a look at the spike that we had seen in VIX contracts surrounding the November election. Here at the end of the chart, you'll see a big jump in September, October, and December futures, but they have calmed after President Biden stepped away and Kamala Harris took his place as the Democratic candidate for president in 2024.
And Matt, there are some stocks moving under the surface. I'm taking a look at CrowdStrike because it continues to be weighed down by the fallout from last week's faulty software update. The stock now facing a wave of analyst downgrades heading into Monday morning. CrowdStrike down almost 5% pre-market.
All right, we had an amazing Sunday, right? I mean, everybody, I'm sure, was glued to the television, all over the wires, checking out the news after Biden stepped back, only telling his team 1 minute before tweeting it out, and then coming out and supporting Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it was pretty wild seeing those headlines cross at about 1:45 p.m. And what's been staggering is watching all the money flood in. According to Act Blue data, Democrats have raised more than $50 million online since Biden announced he was stepping down. Really, talk about cash on the sidelines there.
And that's when it comes to the race itself. But what about the big money in the markets? It's interesting. You see some of those Trump trades fluctuating through the weekend. You pointed it out this morning, this idea that the steepener kind of unwound over the weekend. But DJT still up pre-market, I believe. So it's just a trade at the end of the day.
All right, Vice President Kamala Harris is set to speak to the media this afternoon, where she may officially begin her presidential campaign. Pangea Policy founder Terry Haynes spoke earlier on her potential running mate.
They need a geographic balance ticket, and they need frankly, I think they need a swing state governor on the ticket. That strikes me kind of as Captain Obvious. They've shown weakness in the swing states. It's capturable. They need somebody that actually kind of knows that ground and can speak center speak more than anything else, and it has a background of being successful with centrist voters.
All right, for Vice President Harris's campaign, we're joined by Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern. Really, for the entire election coverage, we have Annmarie Hordern. What do you think about the running mate question? I mean, everyone's talking about the possibility of swing state governors, but you've also got people like astronaut Mark Kelly, Senator Mark Kelly, in the running.
Well, that would potentially be a play for Arizona, so still a swing state, not one of the governors, though. We do know, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, that she got on the phone last night with 3 really critical people. Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina. You had Andy Beshear of Kentucky, who today was asked about it, and he said he's flattered by the idea, fully endorses Kamala Harris, and would maybe step aside from his job if he was asked to serve his country in a different way. And Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, very interesting, because this is where Donald Trump really wants to take the fight. It's these 3 critical swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So Josh Shapiro would be incredibly interesting because this is a way potentially get out the votes in a state that for the Democrats are really a must-win.
And can you just talk to us about sort of the tick-tock of the final moments of the Biden campaign? I mean, to see, again, those headlines, 1:45 p.m. yesterday, that statement
Right,
okay.
1:45 is when apparently he told the campaign.
That's true. So, I mean, that sort of speaks to sort of the disorganization, and then the fact that the statement came on X. It wasn't an Oval Office address. What did the urgency look like there when it came to actually coming out?
So I still think we're trying to figure out exactly why they decided to do it this way. I think the president was probably dragging his feet, oohing and aahing for a couple of days. I mean, covering President Biden, one thing is clear. He does drag his feet with a lot of decisions. He waits. He wants to listen to everyone in the room. And then, of course, he probably looked to his wife for his last final gut check. And then when the decision was made, they moved quickly to post it on Twitter. We still have not heard from President Biden. Now, he does have COVID and he's isolating, but he also did run a campaign, largely a lot of the time, doing interviews, speaking to the American people in 2020, speaking to the American people from isolation. He was during COVID, it was during the pandemic. So there's a lot of pushback on why we have yet to hear from him. Potentially, maybe some of the individuals were putting so much pressure on him to act that a lot of these leaks were coming out in the media. Potentially they were going to say, we're going to go public with some of our data that we do not think you can win November 5th. But we are expected to hear from him this week. In that letter, he did note, I'm going to address the American people later this week, but we still don't have a date. We don't know when we're going to hear from him. What we do know, we're going to see Kamala Harris today.
A lot of uncertainty, and that's our thanks to Bloomberg's chief political correspondent, Annmarie Hordern, who is also, of course, co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance. Now, for more on the risk in the markets and the campaign itself, we are joined by Charles Myers, Signum Global Advisors chairman and founder. Charles has over 25 years of U.S. political and electoral experience advising candidates, including Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, of course, who both have come out and endorsed Kamala Harris. And Charles, if you think about the biggest challenges that Kamala Harris has as she seeks to A, secure the Democratic nomination, and B, looks to take on Donald Trump, what are those challenges?
Well, I think the first is she has to unify the party, which seems to be happening very quickly. In fact, all the endorsements that have come out, not only President Biden's, but the Clintons, an increasingly large number of Hill Democrats, most donors, and then also some of the potential challengers to her. Governor Newsom has endorsed her. Whitmer has said she's not going to run. Now Manchin just came out literally in the last 20 minutes to say he's not going to run. So, unifying the party is happening quicker, even faster than people expected. Secondly, she needs to pick a running mate. You just spent time on that on your show. I think Mark Kelly of Arizona is very much in the top two, along with Cooper of North Carolina, but there are others. They need a swing state. Third, she really needs to introduce herself as a presidential candidate, along with her running mate. And lastly, dispel some of the concern about her 2020 presidential race, where it was very short-lived and not very well run. So that's a lot to do, and the election's 3 months away.
In terms of the effects on the markets, Charles, we have been trying to divine what the dollar trade is telling us, what Bitcoin is telling us, how the curve steepener looks. What's your best take as someone who advises hedge funds and high net worth individuals on the intersection of, Wall Street and Washington?
So what we've been saying is, for our clients that are positioned for the Trump trade, to maybe be a bit cautious, because I do think that that's going to fade a little bit here. When you have a huge shakeup in an election, this is a historic shakeup with a sitting president who's won the primary, now dropping out of the race. You typically see quite a bit of enthusiasm and momentum behind the new candidate. And then she's going to pick her running mate. Then they go into the convention mid-August. I think she'll close the gap. Kamala will close the gap in the polls with Trump, maybe even pull ahead. So I think the Trump trade, at least in the short term, there's some risk of it fading a bit. What we're getting asked about is what is the Harris trade, and the two things that come to mind immediately are renewable plays, but I think it's a bit early to really be trying to decide anything on our election. But secondly, if she wins the White House, I do think it'll be she and her administration, like the Biden administration, will be a little less pro-crypto, as certainly Trump and Vance are.
Yeah, of course, a lot of ifs there, a lot to get through before we get to the actual election and perhaps what that Harris trade might be. But let's talk about the convention first, because, of course, this is a very narrow timeline, and there's a lot of questions about what the convention will actually look like. We heard from Joe Manchin saying today that Harris has basically been anointed, but what are the possibilities that we could see in mid-August?
Yeah, so, one of the reasons, the main reason I believe that the Obamas and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have not endorsed Kamala is to make sure that it doesn't look like a coronation, that it will go to the convention, and it will be the only people in the country that can decide whether or not Kamala Harris will be the nominee. are the just under 4,000 delegates at the convention. It's a simple round of voting. It's a simple majority. I think she wins in the first round. And if not, it goes to the second round of delegates and super delegates that are party officials. She'll win in the second round, but I think she wins in the first round. So any notion that this is a coronation, I think, is a little misplaced. It still goes to the convention mid-August, and it's up to the delegates.
How much of a time crunch does that put on her? Because by the time you get to the convention, you're really looking at less than 80 days to the election.
Oh, absolutely. That's the reason we don't think President Biden's going to resign the presidency. There's going to be increasing calls for Kamala to invoke the 25th Amendment and bring a vote to the cabinet to remove the president, or that he resigns the presidency. We don't think that's going to happen, precisely because of your question. Trying to literally launch a new campaign, a relatively new campaign, in 3 months and run the country, I think, are a lot to ask. I think President Biden stays in the White House and Kamala runs the campaign. They're going to retool it. It's already happening very quickly. It's a condensed campaign. Sometimes those are better. Ask our friends in the UK. Shorter campaigns can be better.
Yeah, Republicans, though, already making that threat to the presidency and making maybe a legal threat to the Harris campaign. Is it substantial or substantive when they say, it's not fair to pass the money that the Biden-Harris ticket has raised to a sole Harris ticket?
No, there are two potential legal challenges. One is the money, but the truth is all the money was raised, or almost all of it, into the Biden-Harris Victory Fund. So she gets the money instantly, and they can challenge that. I think they're wasting their time. The second, because she will get the money, and the rules are pretty clear. The second challenge is for Biden, for the states and at the convention to swap out Biden's name for her name. And that legal challenge also will be, I'm not even sure it makes it to the courts, but will be thrown out because Biden isn't officially the nominee. He has not yet been confirmed by the delegates. If this were at the convention, if this were after the convention, some of those legal challenges might hold. But the truth is, he has won the primary. He's not the nominee yet. So I think all of the legal challenges, including from the Heritage Foundation, are all going to be a waste of time.
Charles, what do you think this means for the Trump campaign? Of course, you think about what we learned and heard at the RNC last week. It was a lot of anti-Biden messaging. Obviously, they're going to have to retool that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Trump was on CNN last night saying that they want a refund because they've spent so much money on Biden. The truth is, Biden's decision did catch a lot of people by surprise. I think it was increasingly clear he would need to drop out. I think his timing was a bit of a surprise, even to some of his own staff. And it didn't give, therefore, the Trump campaign enough time also to kind of, retool. Both sides are very well funded. They will find a way to retool pretty quickly. But, I think the bigger issue is you now have a Democratic nominee and soon-to-be candidate, confirmed candidate, who's uniting the party, very well funded, with a lot of enthusiasm, and very importantly, will drive more turnout by women, young voters, and black voters in the swing states. If I were in the Trump campaign, I'd be sweating today. I think that she's going to give him a real run for his money.
Charles, great to get your take. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Charles Myers there of Signum Global Advisors. Let's get another quick check on futures. We are up across the board this morning with the S&P futures up 0.2%. You see NASDAQ futures up more than 1%, and Russell futures gaining as well, about 0.6%. So strong gains across the board, whether you look at the big mega cap stocks or the small caps. Coming up, Keith Lerner, Chief Market Strategist at Truist Advisory, joins us. He says Washington's influence on markets may be overstated. This is Bloomberg. It's time for High Interest to look at what's making headlines around the world. China caught investors by surprise with an interest rate cut overnight. The PBOC cut the 7-day reverse repo rate to 1.7%. The move is the central bank's first reduction in almost a year as the country attempts to prop up growth. An investment partnership between Ray Dalio's office and an Abu Dhabi royal has been delayed as Bridgewater grapples with the legal terms of his exit from the hedge fund. One of the questions is whether the billionaire founder may use the company's intellectual property after he signed a non-compete with his former firm. And Kimberly Cheadle, the director of the U.S. Secret Service, is about to face a barrage of questions from lawmakers who seem to want her out of a job. Cheadle is set to appear at a congressional hearing that will examine how the shooter behind the attempted assassination of Donald Trump eluded security and wounded the Republican nominee. Katie?
Well, going back to politics, our next guest says that presidential policies have less of an effect on markets than expected. Joining us now, I'm thrilled to say we have Keith Lerner. He is Truist Advisory Co-CIO and Chief Market Strategist. And Keith, I'm going to go to the first bullet in your note this morning that the past 3 presidents have seen the S&P 500 compound at an annual rate between 12 to 15%. And given that history, how worked up should investors specifically, not traders, investors be this morning?
Well, first, great to be with you. And going back to that study you just mentioned, we actually used that study also a couple of years ago during the last election. And our work says this: elections matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. So again, I don't want to say that some of the policy shifts aren't going to make a difference. But when you look back historically, conventional wisdom around what sectors and how the market does around an election tends to be often wrong. And why is that? Well, because other factors matter. What's the direction of the economy? What's the direction of inflation? What are central banks doing? What is profitability doing? And if you think more recently, like actually about 2 weeks ago on a Thursday, we had a CPI report that we all know where we saw small caps have the 4th largest outperformance to large caps we've seen since 1979. And why was that? It was because they had underperformed for about 6 months at the greatest pace we've seen in about 20 years. And then the catalyst was that CPI report, and then small caps ripped, right? So now maybe you can say some of the elections and the polls have, amplified that move. But then overnight, something totally different. We saw China, drop rates a little bit, right? So this morning, you see, what happened with, with maybe the polls getting a little bit tighter, and you can say, okay, well, maybe China's getting a relief because of that, but maybe it's getting a relief because the interest rate cuts overnight.
Let's talk a little bit about that rotation trade. Katie loves it. She's got the Russell up on her screens all the time. Does that continue, or do you think it's run out of room at this point?
Well, I ultimately think there's going to be more to it, but I will say the next few weeks, going back to other factors matter more. This week, we have big cap tech coming to the forefront, right? We have Alphabet coming out with earnings. We have Tesla. And then next week, we have Meta and Apple as well. So I think that's going to be important. And on a short-term basis, just for this week, the NASDAQ or the technology sectors underperformed or pulled back about 6 or 7% around support. So we're bouncing this morning. And then small caps had a big, overshoot. So I think maybe this week you maybe see a little bit of reversion kind of back to tech. But as we look over the next 3 months or so, I do think this trade for small caps likely has a bit further to go. Part of that reason is before this big move up, small caps were, as I mentioned earlier, underperforming by the most we've seen since COVID, and before that, the technology bubble. So I think there's some folks that are offsides, and I think positions still offside. As you think about 12 months or longer than that, I think it's going to be hard because the earnings have not moved up. But again, to your question, I think the small cap trade ultimately has more legs, maybe a little bit of a consolidation first, though.
Well, Keith, not to torture the English language here, but should we be calling it a rotation, or is this just a catch-up trade, a broadening out, if you will?
I think you can call it either. I mean, in some ways, it is a catch-up because, we had the S&P 500 up about 19% prior to this rally, and then small caps were negative for the year. So you're seeing that road band that was so stretched, and now things are kind of coming back in. So maybe that's a little bit of a catch-up. On the same token, I don't think you're seeing the headline market fall apart. You're seeing overextended areas like semiconductors and NASDAQ pull back. Semiconductors are down about 10, 11% off the highs, but they're still up, more than 30% for the year. Technology is still up more than 25%. So I think it's a little bit about a little rotation and a little bit of a catch-up trade all in one. I wish I had a great word for that.
When you're thinking about some of the big cap stocks or the big cap tech names here, you still have to remember that last week the Magnificent Seven as a group sold off about 5%. The S&P was down almost 2%. What is the tone under the market here, Keith? Is there still a lot of fear given where valuations are right now?
Well, listen, I do think there's some fear, and as I talk to individual investors, they've never really truly embraced this market because if you look back the last 20 years, they've been through a lot, like, the global financial crisis, the technology bubble. So there's a lot of skepticism as we make new highs. But I think going back to the question about rotation, rotation is the bloodline of a bull market. I still think we're in a bull market that's to be respected at this point. So again, I would expect more of these kind of shifts as we go along, but kind of rotation where the headline market still kind of holds up and other areas actually participate, I think is actually a healthy sign. I think by the end of the year, I think you will see money rotate back towards tech because that is still the secular story of this bull market.
All right, Keith, really great to get some time with you on this Monday morning. Our thanks to Keith Lerner of Truist Advisory. Now, coming up, we'll take a look at the companies making the most social buzz today in our Social Climber segment. Up next, this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller. Let's get a quick check of what's going on in futures. We are up 2/3 of 1% on S&P futures ahead of the open in just about 6 minutes time. NASDAQ futures up 1.2%. So some big gains for big tech as we digest the political news that we got over the weekend and prepare for the big earnings news that we're going to get throughout the week. Katie?
All right, it's time now for Social Climbers. The company's making waves this morning. And first up, Delta is apologizing for canceling thousands of flights during the busiest travel weekend of the summer. Many of its systems failed following the catastrophic CrowdStrike outage on Friday. We heard from CEO Ed Bastian blaming the impact on a significant number of functions that rely on Microsoft Windows operating system, including its crew tracking tools, rendering the airline unable to process large volumes of changes to flight personnel. Next up, we have Tellurian, shares soaring more than 65% in the pre-market. The Australian gas producer Woodside, it's agreed to buy the US-based LNG project developer for about $900 million. Now, Woodside has been one of the most vocal energy companies in arguing that more gas will be needed to complement the expansion of renewables. And finally, Starbucks. The Wall Street Journal reporting that the activist investor Elliott has built a sizable stake in the coffee chain. Now, Elliott has been pushing Starbucks on ways to boost its stock price. And guys, that is sorely needed. I was just checking. Starbucks shares currently down more than 16% year to date.
What is wrong with Starbucks? I don't understand. You know, there used to be a Starbucks in this building. They got rid of that. There's one across the street here. It's always packed. What's wrong with this company?
It's expensive coffee. And listen, Bloomberg Intelligence thinks that same-store sales could fall this year. I've got to say, one thing that I find fascinating about the Starbucks story, when I talked to activist defense bankers, last year they actually saw the unions, the employees, as the biggest threat, and they thought about that as an activist. Lo and behold, now you have the biggest of all actual activist investors stepping in.
Yeah, that union pressure has been real. I do have actually some more on-the-ground reporting to add. The Starbucks across the street closed down.
Really? So every Starbucks around here is closed?
It closed down in the last 2 weeks. Now I have to get Starbucks near my house before I come to the office in the morning. It's very inconvenient.
Do you not just drink? I know you drink the drip coffee from upstairs. Right?
I was always a Dunkin' girl, but I did convert this weekend, if that counts for anything.
It sort of does. Maybe that'll boost the bottom line. We'll have to see.
Well, anyways, coming up, we're going to speak to the portfolio manager of one of the top performing funds over the last 12 months. We're going to talk to Dan Chung, CEO and CIO of Alger next. Maybe you'll talk to Katie about those small caps. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
We are moments away from the start of trading. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller. We're looking at futures that are up across the board with just about 18 seconds to go. Take a look at the opening bell here on the New York Stock Exchange. The Greenbrier is celebrating 30 years of listing. Over on the NASDAQ, you have Global X ringing the bell. As I said, we have futures that were higher across the board with gains of 2/3 of 1% on the S&P, gains of more than 1% on the NASDAQ. Let's watch these indexes as they open and look for the individual stocks moving the most. For that, we go over to Katie Greifeld. Katie, what do you see?
Let's take a quick look at the majors right now. Of course, as the bell rings, you can see the S&P 500 currently up about 0.7%. The NASDAQ 100, big tech back in charge, up about 1.2%. Again, we had a lot of volatility last week, maybe a little bit of a relief rally right now, including on those small cap names. The Russell 2000 up about 0.4%. 0.1%. But one stock to watch at the opening bell, of course, is Verizon. Lower after reporting operating revenue this morning that missed analyst estimates. The company's weak growth really overshadowing those surprise gains that it saw in the number of fixed wireless customers. Sonali, shares currently down about 4%.
Katie, I'm also keeping an eye here on shares of Bank of America. They're slipping just a bit here after Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway sold about 34 million shares in the bank. But remember, Berkshire still holds more than 998 million shares. Bank of America now just down 0.5%.
All right, and CrowdStrike is weighed down by the continued fallout from a faulty software update that brought global IT down for a long time at the end of last week. Let's get a closer look at CrowdStrike with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abby?
Yeah, Matt, we now have the shares down for a 5th day in a row. This is a 6-day chart, so we can really see this decline. Now, this is just the one-day change. So today down 7.3%, last week down 20% or thereabouts. So in the course of 5 days, roughly down more than 25%. Of course, the company at the epicenter of that global IT outage affecting 8.5 million devices that rely on the Windows operating system. When we connect this with the technicals, because we have a lot of analysts downgrading the stock today, citing reasons such as new deals, resistance there could be to new deals, plus it's the last 2 weeks of the second quarter. By going into the Bloomberg terminal, we're going to see that this stock is right down on its 200-day moving average. And actually, today, this action down 7% on the day, down below that 200-day moving average. This is a fancy way of looking at the long-term buying support, slicing right through it, telling you investors in this stock were totally surprised. The last time we saw this on such a definitive basis, late 2021, ahead of that very difficult 2022 for stocks overall. It's unclear if that's ahead, but this is an ugly chart right now, a broken chart, Sonali.
Abigail, we thank you so much for your analysis. And joining us now for more analysis, Dan Chung, Alger Chief Executive Officer, Chief Investment Officer, and Portfolio Manager. The Alger Capital Appreciation Fund has been rated one of the year's top performing funds, thanks in large part to its heavy tech weighting. But of course, Dan, we know for you, not all tech names are equal to you. So when you think about the dispersion you're seeing in the tech world, what do you like, what don't you like?
Well, we're still very much positive on semiconductors and semiconductor capital equipment, which are some of the leading AI businesses, as well as they're in an industry that's really an oligopoly. So ASML, for example, had issues last week, but this is one of the world's leading companies in tech and essential to semiconductor development. On the flip side, we're more cautious actually on a lot of the enterprise software names and even software generally. I think AI will present some challenges. In particular, AI significantly drops the time and the cost to create software. And so I think we'll see new software competitors emerging in that industry over the years.
Are you at all concerned that we're getting too early a start on this AI enthusiasm? Just like in the tech bubble when everybody was psyched about the internet and ran up the prices, but then we came down. And of course, now the internet turns out to have been a revolutionary technology, but people were just a little too early.
Right. So I think it's actually both. I think we're a little too early in expecting any real results in terms of revenues for most companies. Obviously, NVIDIA has seen huge revenues from AI. But for example, we think software, it's still to come. So a little early for software names to be showing great AI results. In the overall AI cycle, we're still very early.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think where we are sort of in that cycle. It seems like it's too early to pick winners on the software side. NVIDIA, of course, that's a home run, but maybe getting long in the tooth. I want to talk about the specifics of your portfolio, though, because 40% of your outperformance over the last 12 months was driven by tech. Tell us about the other 60%, though, that wasn't necessarily just tech.
Right. So, we fundamental research shop and run a very diversified portfolio across sectors. And so we had 20% came from healthcare, 20% from consumer discretionary, and 20% from internet/e-commerce, and then
so tech adjacent.
Tech. Well, we really like tech-enabled businesses because every business really today uses a lot of tech, as we saw with the CrowdStrike
Learn
issues.
That painful lesson.
And of course, it's a way to improve efficiency, both on the front end, customer service, revenue generating, as well as efficiency on, say, logistics and delivery. And so we are very focused on tech companies that are focused on enabling their businesses through tech.
Dan, how do you feel about some of these Mag 7 names heading into earnings? Are these moments for you to be buying or taking some profits now, and which names?
Well, we think we're in a stock picker's market. So some names that have come in recently, we are quite bullish on. So Microsoft, we remain very bullish on. Amazon, we remain very, very bullish on. I would say Tesla is sort of in a lull. They don't have much new product introduction now. The Cybertruck is interesting, but not nearly big enough to move the needle. And they're having some issues. The robotaxi rollout was delayed. So, the example of a Magnificent Seven, we're a little bit more cautious near term.
How do you fold in, the political news or, legal rulings? I note that Stanford was where you got your undergrad, right? So that explains the tech. But then you went to Harvard Law, and then you clerked for a Supreme Court justice. Right. So when we get something like the Chevron ruling, do you fold that into your analysis of stocks, or is that stuff, does it not have an immediate effect?
It doesn't have an immediate effect, although occasionally we will see legal rulings and look for companies that are sort of in the crosshairs and realize that sometimes we have a little bit of an inside advantage just from the legal experience at the firm to take a look at those situations.
We have less than a minute left with you, but again, going outside of tech, I'm looking through your list. I see companies such as Deckers, DraftKings, for example, and we talk all the time about this stretched consumer, but it seems like you still see pockets of strength there.
Yeah, those are great examples. The American consumer, first of all, is doing relatively well. Unemployment is still low, wages are still going up. Maybe, and so we look for who are the companies and the brands with the hot products, the emerging category definers. So Deckers is actually really interesting because it's both Uggs, which are beloved for decades now, but also Hoka. And Hoka has really come on, is on fire really in the running shoe category.
You're talking to a Hoka girl right now.
I love Hoka.
Okay, so there's Hoka. We're going to see a lot of it in the Olympics. And then DraftKings is another example. Online sports betting is a new industry, but it's a very old pastime, and technology enabling it is making it much more exciting for millions of people.
Dan, great having you on the program. Thanks so much. I hope you can join us again very soon. Dan Chung there of Alger. Let's head now to Farnborough, the International Air Show there. Our own Guy Johnson is standing by with Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. Guy, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, we welcome now our radio and our television audiences together as we speak to the Governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. Governor, thank you very much indeed for stopping by once again to join us.
Great to be with you. And we were together last year in Paris, and here we are in Farnborough, and there's a lot of planes flying today.
We've hopefully got a quiet patch in the air display that you and I can have a conversation and we can both hear each other. So that's fantastic. Look, the big news obviously over the last 24 hours is Joe Biden stepping aside. A, is this a surprise? B, what does it mean, do you think?
Well, so I'm a Republican governor, and so I'm seeing it from the other side, but the amount of pressure that his party was placing on him to step aside was enormous. And there has been chaos in the Democratic Party. And we've all watched it with the performance, of course, of Joe Biden's administration and the realization that Donald Trump is now ahead in polls in states that Joe Biden won by 10 points, like Virginia, where Joe Biden won by 10 in 2020. And now Donald Trump is either even or up in the polls. And on top of that, you really do see Joe Biden faltering on his ability to campaign. So, no, not a huge surprise. I do think that it's important that the polls really haven't moved much in the last day.
Right.
And I think that reflects the fact that Virginians and Americans recognize that it was the Biden-Harris administration, and she owns the performance. And it's not going to be any different than the one that Joe Biden had.
Sounds like you think they should select somebody else.
Well, it's their choice to select who they want, but I will say that they haven't really selected anybody yet. And I do think the chaos that we've seen in the Democratic Party selection process is only matched by the chaos that they've unleashed on the world and the country. We've had foreign policy chaos, and I firmly believe that if Donald Trump were president, we wouldn't have war in Ukraine, we wouldn't have the chaos in the Middle East that we have, nor would we see China threatening Taiwan like they are. And if Donald Trump were president, we would certainly have a secure border, and therefore every state like Virginia wouldn't be seeing the violence, the drug overdoses, and the illegal immigrant crisis that we've got. And if Donald Trump were president today, I don't think we would have seen the runaway inflation that Joe Biden unleashed and Kamala Harris on America.
So if it is Kamala Harris, do you think Virginia is still winnable? Does it change the arithmetic in any shape or form?
I think that Virginia is still in play.
Right.
And what we're seeing, of course, is Virginians are stating that they want strong leadership, not weak leadership.
Yep.
They know that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden led this administration together, and that track record is her track record. And I think that Americans are reflecting the same sentiment.
Yep.
They're ready for strength in the White House, not weakness.
Why do you think that the Ukraine war wouldn't have happened if President Trump had been around and running things at that point in time?
Because I think he projects strength.
Right.
And we know that there is peace through strength. And Joe Biden, starting with his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, all the way through to placating China, to empty threats on the international stage, only elicits other countries to do bad things. I mean, he completely funded the Iranian assault in the Middle East, because when Joe Biden became president, he undid all of the sanctions and all the isolation that Donald Trump had placed them in.
Let's just stick with Ukraine if we can for a moment. Would the Republican Party continue to support Ukraine? Should the Republican Party, should President Trump and his vice president continue to support Ukraine? Do you think that aid should be there?
Well, let me just begin with the clear statement that the Republican Party as a whole is for defeating Putin. I think what we'll see, of course, is all elements brought together. First thing we'll do is we will secure the border. And that has been the biggest complaint from the Republican Party, is we're sending a lot of money overseas and we haven't even secured our own border. And I think on day one, President Trump will secure our border and stop the chaos that has ensued with illegal immigration. Listen, we've had terrorists come across the border, and we had two illegal immigrants try to crash the front gate at Quantico Marine Corps Base in a box truck in Virginia. And, of course, the free flow of drugs is killing people left, right, and center. We have 5 a day that on average die in Virginia. Job one, secure the border. And then I do believe that support around the world in order to bring peace back through strength will be real. And this is the double approach that I think we'll see under a Trump administration.
Because from a European perspective, it looks like we're going to see a more isolationist government were Trump to win.
Well, I do think what we're going to see is a government that is, one, going to be very clear about what we're going to do, and one that is going to require all of our partners to play a full role. And I believe our partners will. I think what
does playing a full role mean then? Is that 2.5% NATO? Is that 3.5% NATO? What is that?
Well, I think historically it was asking NATO to pay 2% of their GDP in defense, and we've seen a lot of the NATO countries come there. Not all of them, but I think this is also a recognition that Putin is not going to stop at the Ukraine, and everybody needs to do their fair share.
Yep. So is 2.5 enough? Is 3? Where's the number in your mind?
Well, that's going to settle out as we see what the overall spending is going to be to do what we need to do. But I will say this, that I think that the United States will constantly be a great partner, but we also require great partners. And I think that's really what Peace Through Strength is all about.
The debate here at the Farnborough Show is, if we have to spend more money, we're going to try and spend it here. A lot of the defense companies are based in your state. You comfortable with that? If Europe's going to spend more money, should Europe spend that money domestically?
Well, again, there's going to need to be a capabilities match to the need. And a lot of the capabilities have been developed in the United States.
Do you think Europe's capable of doing that?
I think there are certain elements, yes. And there are certain areas where the U.S. capabilities are going to be paramount. And I think the combination of that is really important. We've got a lot of European companies that want to come set up in the United States. A lot of them want to come to Virginia. It's one of the main reasons why I'm here. You may have heard we were ranked top state in America for business. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of them want to come to Virginia. But this idea of European companies coming to the United States and manufacturing and building is really important. And I do think the blending of capabilities on the global stage will provide the best outcomes.
One of the reasons they might be coming to the United States to manufacture is because they're worried about tariffs. Should they be worried about tariffs?
Well, I think they should be worried about tariffs if their country is imposing tariffs on the United States goods. And again, free trade has not always meant free trade, and I think it needs to be fair and reciprocal. And when we look at just the evolution of the trade agreements with China over the last few decades, China had unlimited access to the U.S. market, restricted access to their market, and it wasn't until President Trump struck a really tough China trade deal that we began to really treat them like they are, which is really an adversary who's trying to dominate the world, and they're doing it, yes, through economic coercion and imperialism, but also through military saber rattling, and their surveillance of the world is unparalleled, and so we have to treat them as such, and that means we've got to stand up and use the tools in our toolkit in order to combat it.
Would those tariffs, with the tools that you're talking about being in the toolkit, if they were applied, do you think that's inflationary for the average American?
The short answer is competition is what combats inflation. And as long as we have strong competitive markets, then the short answer is most likely not. But what we do need to recognize is that what is inflationary for the average American is unlimited runaway spending, which is what we saw in the Biden administration. It was irresponsible. They flooded the market with government spending on an unnecessary basis, and that's why we saw inflation like we haven't seen for four decades. And that's why the average American, when they go to the grocery store, they literally, it's a gut punch every time they go in. Gas prices are run away from them, and why 66% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck because they can't keep up with the runaway inflation we've seen over the last 3.5 years.
Governor, great to see you. Thanks for stopping by to see us. Always a
God
pleasure.
Bless you. Come to Virginia.
I will look forward to it. I've been, I love it. Thank you very much indeed, Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia. Back to you.
Our thanks to Bloomberg's Guy Johnson and, of course, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, speaking at a very pivotal time in the electoral race right now. Now, coming up, Abercrombie & Fitch gets a boost from J.P. Morgan. More on that and other stocks as well in Top Calls today. This is Bloomberg.
All right, it's time now for Top Calls. Some of the analyst action in focus this morning. And first up, J.P. Morgan raising Abercrombie & Fitch to overweight. The analyst cites continued broad-based demand for the company's namesake apparel brand. He also notes that Abercrombie's Hollister brand's inflection is only in the middle innings and brand momentum is building internationally. Next up, Jefferies upgrading 10x Genomics to a buy. The firm cites conviction in single-cell recovery for that upgrade. Jefferies also sees continued utility in areas such as oncology research and says that 10x has superior technology versus its competitors. And finally, Goldman Sachs downgrading Lerner to neutral. The firm sees less upside in Lerner shares versus others in the home builder group when considering that the operating environment, what it is over the coming quarters. Now coming up, mega donor George Soros backs VP Kamala Harris. That and more in our Wall Street Beat. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. Let's get a check on this stock market. About 20 minutes into the U.S. trading day, you can see equities broadly higher. The S&P 500 up about 0.9%. The NASDAQ 100, 1.5%, a real rally on our hands. The Russell 2000, the small caps, joining in on some of the fun, up about 0.3%, Sonali.
And Katie, now it's time for the Wall Street Beat. The most talked about stories in finance, and our top story today is Vice President Kamala Harris. She has the backing of billionaires such as George Soros, but some donors are calling for an open nomination process. You take a look at the story on the Bloomberg terminal, and for example, Mike Novogratz, billionaire who had called for President Biden here to step down, is saying that this should be a mini bake-off, that it would get a ton of press, and you have to wonder if that's kind of the reason they're holding.
No, I think that's a great idea. And a lot of people are worried that it would imperil maybe her chances. I don't think so. She seems to have more than 80% of Democrats backing. It would be an event that draws attention. Look how much we paid attention to the RNC, right? And a drumbeat up to her eventual nomination. So I think it would only do good for the party.
Yeah, earned media, if you will. I mean, everyone or a lot of people organically paying attention. It is interesting, though, to see some of the pushback in the hours after, of course, Biden endorsed Kamala, that this is basically an anointment, a coronation, and it makes sense that some of the donors would maybe want actually to see some sort of contest.
Within 90 minutes, $75,000 raised from 700 donors. Now, the small tickets as well as the big tickets are something to watch because it signals support. Far out idea here. Remember, there are a lot of Republican-leaning billionaires that have been on the sidelines. You have to wonder if now their distaste for Trump shows up in the Kamala ticket.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see who she chooses, obviously, as vice president, because if she chooses someone who's seen as less progressive, and let's face it, she has to be seen as very progressive from California. Maybe that would help her get some centrist votes.
This is one of the rare instances where I feel like the vice presidential pick really matters. I mean, if you look at political science, history, et cetera, the VP pick really doesn't truly matter that much in the grand scheme of things. Here, in this unprecedented situation, maybe it's a little bit different.
Yeah, although it can hurt you, right? If you
That's
choose
true.
Sarah Palin, watch out. You might lose that election. Let's get to the trading diary right now, what you need to be watching today and this week. Kamala Harris is set to speak at 11:30 a.m. from the White House. We'll bring you that live, and you can watch it on the Bloomberg terminal as well. Just type TLIV. Tomorrow we get big tech earnings. You heard Dan Chung talking about the Tesla Cybertruck. There it is. We're going to get earnings from Tesla as well as Alphabet, the company that runs Google. On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will address Congress and meet with now lame duck President Joe Biden. On Thursday, we get U.S. GDP and durable goods. Will the economy start to take over in this market? We get PCE on Friday, so another read on inflation that you don't want to miss. Coming up in the next hour, Threadneedle Ventures founder Ann Barry joins us. She thinks markets are in for a roller coaster ride this election season. This is Bloomberg. We are 30 minutes into the trading day. Welcome to Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Sonali Basak.
And I'm Katie Greifeld.
Coming up, an election reset. Vice President Kamala Harris begins to shore up support for a White House run while Trump's campaign makes contingency plans.
As Democrats plot their next steps, we'll follow the money with Mountain CEO Mark Douglas and talk strategy with former government official Bob Hormats.
And muted markets, but rallying nonetheless. Investors looking beyond Biden's exit and gearing up for a flood of earnings and key economic data this week. We take a look at where we stand. Of course, on this Monday morning, there is green across the screen right now. The S&P 500, if we flip up to that, you can see currently it's higher by about 0.7%. Big tech taking charge. You can see the NASDAQ 100 up about 1.4%. The bond market relatively quiet after all the volatility that we've seen. The 10-year Treasury yield currently lower by about 2 basis points, Sonali.
And Katie, donations have surged into the Democratic Party after President Biden announced that he's dropping out of the 2024 race and endorsing Kamala Harris. Charles Myers of Signum Global Advisors spoke to us earlier in the last hour.
Both sides are very well funded. They will find a way to retool pretty quickly. But, I think the bigger issue is you now have a Democratic nominee and soon to be candidate, confirmed candidate, who's uniting the party, very well funded with a lot of enthusiasm, and very importantly, will drive more turnout by women, young voters, and black voters in the swing states. If I were in the Trump campaign, I'd be sweating today. I think that she's going to give him a real run for his money.
For more on how President Biden's exit from the race changes the outlook for investors, Bloomberg's Enda Curran joins us from Washington to discuss. Another thing, Enda, that Charles had told us is investors are asking him more and more about what the Harris trade is. What is the Harris trade? How does that differ from the Biden trade?
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait for specific details. But like you mentioned, Sonali, into the weekend, economists and investors and analysts had become, increasingly interested in looking towards the Trump policy agenda, which was, of course, higher tariffs, lower taxes, perhaps pressure to lower interest rates, and of course the fiscal trajectory will be impacted by all of that as well. Now, as you mentioned, it's swung back, and the question becomes will Vice President Harris kind of be continuity for the Biden economic policy agenda, or where exactly will she shake it up? We haven't got those details yet, but certainly on the one hand, of course, she can tout the Biden administration's achievements that they claim in terms of industrial policy and investment in the new green manufacturing and the other areas. But of course, as we know, the Trump campaign are very critical of the Biden administration record on inflation and on some of those very same subsidies. So I think we're very much now looking at a wild card when it comes to economic policy on this. And there's lots of question marks over the weeks ahead, and we might get clarity as Vice President Harris gets into her campaign.
Yeah, a lot remains to be seen how much the Harris policy portfolio is truly different from what we saw under the Biden administration. But what is clear at this moment is that this was a needed shot in the arm when it comes to fundraising. Over $50 million raised just yesterday. I mean, talk to us about how much that factors into perhaps the Harris campaign if she truly is the nominee.
Well, there's no doubt that it looks like yesterday obviously was a very strong day for fundraising for the new Harris campaign. We'll have to see how that impacts or plays out, if it continues to play out over the coming weeks, and how it impacts whether or not new donors come on board, in particular those maybe from Wall Street or the broader investor world who come on board, touting or supporting Vice President Harris for specific investor or economic policies. And I think that's going to be a very interesting signal to keep an eye out for. As I say, a lot will depend on what kind of policy signals we get from the Vice President over the weeks ahead, heading into that convention. Where will she change things up? Where will she represent continuity? And that's domestic US economic policy. And let's also not forget what's her stance going to be in the world of trade, and especially when it comes to competition with China. Plenty of scrutiny in that area as well.
All right, Enda, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Enda Curran there talking to us about the economic impacts of the Biden policies. Let's continue the analysis with Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way. Matt worked on both Bill Clinton's presidential campaigns and served as the principal White House liaison to governors. Matt, what do you expect Harris to lead with in terms of her campaign? Where can she point to achievements, say, as a senator or attorney general, showing Americans that she really can bring the fight to Trump and win this presidency?
I think what you get with Harris, remember when she ran in 2020, the motto of her campaign was "for the people," which is what a prosecutor says when she stands up in court. I'm Kamala Harris for the people. She is a prosecutor at her core, and she's running against a felon. So the matchup of a prosecutor against a felon is what has a lot of Democrats, including me, pretty excited for this race. I mean, it's going to be very short. She is running on the Biden record, for better and for worse. In my view, a lot of it's for better. And she is going up against a convicted felon and a liar and an adjudicated rapist and sexual assaulter. And I think she's in pretty good shape to take that fight to him.
You know, you think about the names being thrown around as potential vice presidential picks for Kamala Harris in the run for U.S. president. But what do you think about this idea of her choosing somebody from a swing state versus somebody with more national recognition?
You know, I started in politics way back on Mike Dukakis's campaign, and he picked Lloyd Bentsen because Bentsen represented Texas. And back then, Texas was sort of a swing state that Dukakis felt like he needed to win. It doesn't really work very often to pick someone just because they'll deliver their state. Vice presidential nominees generally don't have a huge impact on the outcome of the election, either in their state or elsewhere. What I think she needs is somebody who balances the ticket and gives an additional jolt of energy, because I think what we're getting now, suddenly the race has shifted and Trump is the old guy in the race. He is 19 years older than Kamala Harris. And if she picks somebody who is her age contemporary, that'll continue.
And of course, we've seen in the last 24 hours, not even that, we've seen a ton of endorsements coming from Democrats, but we haven't seen Barack Obama endorse Harris. So far, he's been quiet on that. Is there anything to extrapolate out of that, those people that haven't yet endorsed Harris as the party's nominee?
I really don't think so. I think there's two reasons for that, certainly for President Obama and Speaker Emerita Pelosi. Both of them were involved in helping convince President Biden to step aside. I think they were very mindful that yesterday was his moment, that was his decision. It was historic and monumental. And it came very painfully because he was simply too old, not because he hadn't performed well in office. And that was very personal and painful for him. I think Obama wanted to wait a beat before moving on to endorsing someone. And also, he wants to be the honest broker in the party and ensure that if there was going to be any kind of contest for the nomination, he wasn't putting his finger on the scale It now appears there won't be, and I'm sure he will endorse her soon.
Matt, the concern from Republicans and some Democrats is that he is too old to perform in office as president. After we saw his debate performance, which really looked like serious cognitive decline, can he stay in the Oval Office, or does he have to step down as acting president and hand Kamala the reins now?
I don't think he does. I mean, look, I don't know. I've not spent time with the president in the last several months, but from all accounts, he is perfectly capable of serving as president for the next 6 months. What became clear in the debate is that he might not be capable of serving as president for the next 4.5 years, and that's an enormously different calculus. So I've seen nothing to suggest that he can't do the job until January. I think he can, and I think it would be very surprising if he wasn't president as we go into the inauguration.
I'm really curious. You saw after Trump came out during the RNC and chose J.D. Vance as his vice presidential pick. You know, Third Way defines itself as a national think tank championing modern center-left ideas. When you look at the potential vice presidential pick for Kamala Harris, what do you think is going to win most of the country here in terms of the type of vice president's values that she brings on board?
Well, look, Democrats start it always in a hole. We have got to win supermajorities of moderate, self-identified moderate voters. Republicans have a much larger base. There are more conservatives than there are liberals in America, which means when presidential candidates for Democrats don't win 63% or more of self-identified moderates, we tend to lose. So I think it's very important that not only in her choice for her vice presidential nominee, but also in the way that she runs for president in the next 3.5 months, that the vice president understand that the people she needs to appeal to are self-identified moderates and swing voters. I think she does, and that's why I'm pretty hopeful.
And of course, you said that for better or worse, she is running on the Biden record. And you think about her issues with the border, for example. President Biden basically saying that she was in charge of the border issue in March 2021. A lot of people would say that hasn't gone that well. When you think about the Harris campaign here, how should she message that?
Well, technically, of course, he didn't put her in charge of the border. He put her in charge of Central American policy, which obviously had a huge impact on the border. But that is a distinction, to be fair, that's lost on a lot of voters. I think what she's got to do is continue the president's recent actions on the border, which have been tough and smart and necessary. And border crossings are massively, massively down.
A little too late,
the border
though,
is not in crisis at this moment.
I mean, putting in those policies right ahead of an election to try and get the vote isn't what Americans want, right? The problem is during his entire presidency, it was a real problem that he and Harris seemed to do nothing about.
Well, I would argue that it was a real problem that had been many, many years in the making. Don't forget that President Trump also experienced enormous surges at the border. Our asylum policy is broken, and Congress has done nothing to fix it. The president and the vice president both endorsed a very tough bill that very conservative Republicans in the Senate had put together, but Trump instructed Republicans in Congress to tank it, and they did. So there has been no congressional action. That's the only thing that's really going to fix this long term. The president so far has kind of gone to the extent of his powers under executive orders to do what he can about the border. There's not much more he can do unless Congress acts.
All right, Matt, really appreciate your perspective on this very, very busy day. Our thanks to Matt Bennett of Third Way. Meanwhile, let's get back to these markets and what's moving underneath the surface. We're going to do that with Abigail Doolittle.
In contrast to last week, we have the big tech trade working out. NVIDIA, Tesla, Microsoft, Apple all higher, and this could be some reflection of this reset 2024 presidential election, because, of course, last week, one reason big tech was falling was the idea that if Donald Trump was elected, that their administration could potentially be negative for tech. We don't know those policies yet at all. But NVIDIA, also Piper Sandler saying they might put up another big beat. And then you see Tesla, Microsoft, Apple, lots of green here on this screen. We also have the shares of Reddit trading higher, and this comes as they have struck a deal to team up with the NFL and NBA to boost revenue, up about 3% right now, and in fact, up more than 90% since its March IPO. And then finally, it's not all green. In fact, we have the indexes off of their highs. The S&P 500 up about 0.5%. It had been up 1%. This is certainly one laggard, down 6.5%. They missed estimates as fewer people upgraded their wireless equipment. And I would say, Matt, price to perfection, the stock into today, actually today still up about 40%, into today, up about 40% off of the October low. So again, price to perfection, they did not deliver that.
Abigail, thanks very much. Abigail Doolittle talking to us about the stocks on the move today. Coming up, Threadneedle Ventures founder Annmarie, why she thinks markets are in for a roller coaster ride this election season. That volatility to continue. This is Bloomberg. Let's get now to high interest to look at what's making headlines around the world. China caught investors by surprise with an interest rate cut overnight. The PBOC cut the 7-day reverse repo rate to 1.7%. That move is the central bank's first reduction in almost a year as the country attempts to prop up growth. An investment partnership between Ray Dalio's office and Abu Dhabi Royal has been delayed as Bridgewater grapples with the legal terms of his exit from the firm. One question is whether the billionaire founder may use the company's intellectual property after he had signed a non-compete agreement with Bridgewater. And Kimberly Cheadle, the director of the U.S. Secret Service, is about to face a barrage of questions from lawmakers who seem to want her out of a job. Cheadle is set to appear at a congressional hearing that will examine how the shooter behind the attempted assassination of Donald Trump eluded security and wounded the Republican nominee.
All right, let's get a check on these markets right now. You can see the S&P 500 up about 0.7%. Again, big tech leading the way here, reestablishing itself as the market leader. The Nasdaq 100 up about 1.3%. All the while, the bond market pretty quiet. 10-year yields currently down about 2 basis points. Let's tie it all together now with Annmarie. She is founder of Threadneedle Ventures, joining us on set. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Katie. Good to see you too.
Let's talk about volatility.
Yeah.
Because the S&P 500, we were down 2% last week. We're up pretty significantly right now. And the VIX, out of nowhere, suddenly we have a 16 handle all of a sudden. Is this basically what the next 4 months is going to look like?
I think it's barely scratching the surface of what the next 4 months is going to look like. And let's talk about why we've seen some of this rebound in the S&P 500. You know, tech got a hammering when it looked like J.D. Vance was, being posited as anti-big tech. So we saw these stocks comes down. Now that we're not so sure which way this election's going to go, I think some of that popped back as, frankly, the result of Vice President Kamala Harris being put at the top of potentially the ticket for the Democrats.
Well, what is the Harris trade? That's been a pervasive question in the markets now. What would you buy on a Harris ticket?
I think it's very unclear. The Harris ticket feels more to me like business as usual with Sonali. But here's what I find so fascinating. I don't think that there is truly a Trump trade other than deregulation. It's very unclear because neither sets of candidates so far have really come out with prescriptive policy visions, at least in my opinion, not with any detail.
Right, but is it really deregulation? Because he added J.D. Vance to the ticket, right? And he seems to be anti-Wall Street, at least that's his current color, right? He's somewhat of a chameleon, and anti-big tech.
You know, I'm going to sound a little cynical, actually, Matt, but I feel like I can be here. People tend to be anti those two big money pockets, big money from Wall Street, big money from big tech, until they realize they actually want to get some of their money behind them as it gets closer to the election. So I'm not completely convinced that what is said in the run-up to the vote and what actually transpires once policy is being enacted is going to happen. We've seen people threaten to go after Wall Street and big tech before, and it hasn't really materialized.
It's a great point, too, that a lot of what is being said right now might not actually turn into policy. Let's turn to a known unknown, if you want to call it that. I'm talking about earnings season.
Yes.
Because it's gotten a little bit lost in the conversation. But, of course, big tech kicks off this week. And you think about this interesting juncture we're at in the markets. Now we're going to get a look at the fundamentals. How are you thinking it's going to go?
I think it's actually going to be a little bit rocky, Katie, and something that I've discussed with all of you before is all of the AI euphoria that you've seen. At some point, the market was going to say, the vision is great, guys, now show me the numbers, show me the money, how's it impacting profit, how are you monetizing to drive top line? There hasn't been a lot of really concrete wins announced or examples. If they don't come out on these earnings seasons, if I were these companies, this is where I'd start to flush bad news, quite frankly, in this news cycle.
You know, you think about tech as winners and losers here, and think about pair trades, right? What do you like in this environment to buy? What do you like to sell?
So there's a big long-term one that I like, which is the trade desk. So if you look back at what happened at Netflix last week, Netflix came out with 8 million new subscribers, great growth in terms of that metric, but revenue underperformed. So where you've got more users being under-monetized, that's where the trade desk, which is a demand-side marketplace for ad tech, I think can really win over the long term. We're going to see more and more of these deals go to streamers. We're going to see more and more pressure for them to monetize their user base.
What do you think about, I mean, Elon Musk is giving $45 million a month to a Trump PAC. You know, J.D. Vance was working for Peter Thiel. So do you like Tesla and Palantir, right, if Trump wins?
Yeah, we've talked about Palantir in the past. I put Palantir in the bucket of defense. So let's start there, and I'll come back to Tesla. I think last time we saw that the Trump trade, this is the 26th trade, was very favorable for banks, it was very favorable for energy, it was very favorable for defense stocks. Palantir, I think, would stand to gain in that environment. Tesla's a bit of a different one. I think Tesla's got much more fundamental issues. You've got the GMs and the Fords going after it. You've got the Chinese competitors taking share. And it's not as though former President Trump is the greatest advocate for green energy or for a move to EV. So I'm a little bit more neutral on Tesla.
Yeah, he had some pretty harsh comments for EVs. And of course, the problems that Tesla is dealing with feel like just car company problems. And it'll be interesting to see how Elon Musk manages through that. But I actually want to go back to what you were saying about AI and the AI spend, because so far it feels like AI has just been a margin compression story. And I'm wondering, I mean, if we do see some of those other names start to falter, aren't actually showing up in the numbers, what that AI spend has been producing, does that filter back through NVIDIA, perhaps?
I think it could filter back through NVIDIA, but I think NVIDIA is still going to stand to benefit in that it is still going to be the dominant player for the most sophisticated chips out there. I don't think we see NVIDIA get hit imminently. I do think that software companies, Katie, will be more easily able to show that that investment in AI is translating into productivity gains. So I think that margin compression may actually turn relatively quickly. It's places like the social media platforms I worry about.
You know, and it's very difficult here to separate the political from the earnings cycle right now. But there is an aspect of this. You think about Alphabet and its supposed more than $20 billion deal to buy Wiz that's been reported about, both in a Republican administration and in a Democratic administration. A deal like that could be contested, can it not?
It could be contested, and let's go back to this point, Matt. So J.D. Vance, actually, I think it was at a Bloomberg event in D.C. in February, came out in support of Lena Khan, the FTC head, and said, look, I'm really in favor of preventing some of these big deals. So I think we'll see. That being said, as a side note, you can't separate the politics from the tech. When it comes to the J.D. Vance Trump ticket, it's the Trump show. At the end of the day, what Trump decides, I think, will fly. The Wiz deal, Sonali, I do find very interesting because it's a pivot from AI to cybersecurity in Alphabet's narrative. It's a very expensive deal. It's either 20 or 40 times annualized revenue, depending on what you read. To me, it's a discussion around the integration that's critical.
A lot to keep an eye on. That is Annmarie of Threadneedle Ventures. We thank you for joining us here on set. And still ahead, we're going to take a look at the companies making the most buzz today. We're going to talk about the social climbers next. This is Bloomberg.
All right, it's time now for Social Climbers. The company's making waves on social media this morning. And first up, Delta apologizing for canceling thousands of flights during the busiest travel weekend of the summer so far. Many of its systems failed following the catastrophic CrowdStrike outage on Friday. CEO Ed Bastian blamed the impact on a significant number of functions that rely on Microsoft's Windows operating system. Next up, speaking of CrowdStrike, continuing to be weighed down by Friday's fallout, at least 2 firms downgraded the stock after the outage, which of course affected 8.5 million devices that rely on Microsoft's Windows system there. And finally, we have famed donut maker Krispy Kreme sold its majority stake in late-night cookie seller Insomnia Cookies to private equity firms Verlinvest and Mistral Equity Partners. Now, the deal has an enterprise value of $350 million, which Krispy Kreme said doubled since it acquired Insomnia Cookies in 2018. Of course, you can follow all the latest company buzz on TREN Go on your Bloomberg terminal.
All right, Katie, thanks very much. Katie Greifeld there with your social buzz. Wait, what do we call that?
Social climbers.
Social climbers. Social climbers. Got it. Okay. Coming up, Mark Douglas, CEO of advertising software company Mountain, joins us. He'll tell us what he's expecting for campaign spending this election season. It could be as much as $16 billion from all the parties. This is Bloomberg. Total political ad spending in this country is projected to reach a record $16 billion this year. That according to paid ad agency Group M. Our next guest says Trump and Harris aren't getting enough bang for their buck. Mark Douglas is the CEO of ad software company Mountain. He joins us now to talk about that and also the streamers and Google. But I wanted to start with this, Mark, because it's an area that you know everything about. Yeah. It's a massive amount of spending for political ads, but I don't really see them very much.
Right, exactly. I don't either. So put in this perspective, that's like the equivalent of 10% of, or even a bit more, Meta's revenue. And now these ads are generally on TV, but do you see them like everywhere? I don't. Roughly $60 billion, maybe close to $70 billion to spend on TV advertising. So this should be like something like 3 out of every 10 ads you see on TV. I don't see them. I don't see the effectiveness of them. We're still living in a society where we're just broadcasting them out rather than being very targeted. I don't think any of the political campaigns are getting their money's worth at all, and all to move the needle 1%.
You know, you think about just how much was used by the Biden campaign alone. 93% of the money raised in June
That's
spent.
an amazing
And
figure,
he's no longer running.
Right.
So where does the new money go? If you could do it all over again and decide where that money goes that's targeted, how do you redo it?
And how do you see it, Mark? Because in this industry, right, you know everyone who's moving those dollars around.
We have a big, at Mountain, we have a big partnership with Stagwell. Stagwell dominates 2 of the big political agencies. And by the way, there's a separate agency for Republicans and Democrats. No one talks to each other under the same umbrella. And so, how are they going to raise the money? Trump has been crushing it. Now, Democrats have to kind of, get that machine restarted. And then they have very little time. I think a lot of money is going to be spent. Like we said, it's going to move the needle maybe 1%. To move it, the 8% that's needed right now seems like a very big task and would cost more money than I think people are ready to donate.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. I mean, so there's a lot of money being spent.
Yeah.
It's not being spent very efficiently.
Right.
It seems like the eyeballs are just not where it's being broadcast. What do you do? Do you put ads on TikTok? I mean, how do you capture especially those younger voters that both parties care about?
Right. I think that's the move. You have to get basically the campaigns are used to just broadcast, literally just almost burning dollars, just broadcasting them out. And they have to get much, much more targeted at the voters they're trying to reach. And the way to do that is using, like social media, you're doing paid marketing on social, although remember a few years ago, Meta got in a lot of trouble for all the political ads on Meta, so we don't even know what their appetite is to even allow that. And then on television, there's now, like my company, Mountain, we do performance TV, but I don't think the political these parties are ready for it. So I think you're going to see this election cycle, it's going to happen in the way it's been done in the past, just ads. Just spend as much money as you can, and then, hopefully we learn for the next one. I don't see it happening in the next 3 months.
In terms of the streamers, Mark, I mean, we got Netflix results at the end of the week. Really impressive subscriber number, but I think I and all of us here don't ever see ads there because we pay for a higher tier, right? Yeah. On Hulu, they sneak ads in, but because of that, I watch less of it.
Right.
How are we going to see advertising in a streaming world?
Yeah, so Amazon's been crushing it. And I think there's a lot to learn there for Netflix, and I think they will. And what the difference is, Amazon is acting like a tech company when it comes to advertising on television. That's why they moved their entire customer base to ad-supported, basically in one day. And Netflix is acting like a media company. The irony is Netflix literally launched in Silicon Valley. Its roots are a tech company, and they need to kind of go back to that for advertising. And when they do, I think you're going to see another big round of growth for them. Their ad business is only, I think they reported $700 million in spend, which is tiny in the grand scheme of things against, I think it's roughly like $30 billion in total revenue on SVOD, subscriptions. So I think they can make their ad-supported tier be 50%, even double this of the current size of the company, even double size of the company. So as investors, I'm in it for the long. I'm a big Netflix fan, being critical now, but become a tech company again, and they win.
Well, what else do you like on the ad side here? You're talking about political ad spend at big dollars here. You're also talking about more and more companies. You think Amex, you think insurance companies looking to boost marketing spend once again.
Yeah.
Who's the beneficiary of all that at the end of the day? Streamers, traditional media, or what?
Well, the big trend has been retail media, which is that's how you have like JP Morgan Chase just launched a new advertising product. T-Mobile has a big advertising product. So retail media is basically just better data targeting, using more data relevant to purchases and things like that. I think, though, at the end of the day, Amazon is doing a great job. NBC is doing a great job with the Olympics this year. I think they've really gotten a groove where they're using broadcast ads and like very targeted programmatic ads for the Olympics and crushing it. Probably going to be the most successful Olympics in history. And again, Netflix has all of the chips to play this game well, but they have to go back to being a tech company when they play that game.
We have Google coming out tomorrow. You haven't mentioned Alphabet. What do you expect from them, and where do you think we're going to see the biggest moves?
I don't expect Google to have anything spectacular happening. I think it's going to be kind of, I was going to say a throwaway quarter, but just like no one's going to remember this past quarter for Google. But they have a lot to figure out on AI. I think they're under a lot of stress on that. When I work with the people at the company, their tone is, they're not as arrogant. Maybe that's the simplest way to put it.
Humble.
They've been humble. That's a really good way to put it. And so I think as they use that humbling to execute better, that we'll hopefully see a revived Google in a few quarters. But right now, I think it's just kind of like more of the same.
All right, Mark, great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us. Mark Douglas, they're the CEO and founder of Mountain. Let's get a check now on the markets. For that, we go to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abby, what do you got?
Well, after last week's decline, we have a pretty solid gain at this point for the S&P 500, up about 0.8%. Now, this is the overnight picture of the S&P 500 E-mini futures. And upon the open yesterday evening, after that somewhat shocking and yet expected news of President Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential race, not up so much and then a little bit bumpy, and then you see right after the open up at the highs, up more than 1% at that point. I think this has to do with some yen strength, which means that carry trade coming off in terms of the dip down, and now there's a little bit of an inversion there. As for the strength itself, what stocks are driving it, just what you were talking about, big tech. Take a look at Apple, Microsoft, both up 1% or more. NVIDIA up 3.9%. Piper Sandler are saying that they expect them to put up another big quarter, and of course, they won't be reporting for many weeks yet, but nonetheless, that expectation helping. Plus, that stock, among all of these stocks, last week down in a big way on the quote-unquote Trump trade. Now, as we have the possibility of Kamala Harris being the official presidential nominee, we of course don't know that yet, but it seems as though that side of the trade is unwinding as people try to vet what a Harris-Trump election could mean and would look like. And then finally, if we take a look at U.S. high yield spreads, they're tightening. Investors are heading toward the riskier and smaller companies. We see this here, and that would support what we just saw with the big companies higher as well. It's a risk-on day.
All right, Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll take a look at how change in the White House race could affect U.S.-China relations. Former U.S. Undersecretary of State Bob Hormats joins us next in today's Wall Street Week. This is Bloomberg. It's time now for our daily Wall Street Week conversation. And today, we're taking a look at what President Biden's decision to withdraw from the White House race means for U.S. policy towards China. Here's what Bloomberg guests have had to say so far.
What is clear and what is undisputed is that there were likely going to be a lot more trade wars. We're likely going to see tariffs being used as a geopolitical, new weapon.
The fact is, there is going to be a much tougher relationship, regardless of the administration, with China.
President Biden has been more effective, I think, in terms of hitting China in ways that matter for U.S. security. President Trump is promising 10% tariffs across the board on all nations, a so-called flat 60 on China. So I think it is a vitally important election for U.S.-China relations.
And I'm pleased to say that former U.S. Undersecretary of State Bob Hormats joins us now, along with Wall Street Week host David Weston. David, there's a lot of big questions in this election cycle, but of course, one of them is foreign policy.
Yeah, and a lot of them are being asked in Beijing, I suspect, right now. Bob, it's really great to have you here. You know China well. You spent a lot of time over there. So there's a lot of developments all of a sudden. Give us your sense, coming out of the party plenum, which all had to do with their economy. What do they think about the U.S. election and how it may affect their economy?
Well, I think all these commentaries are right. They probably look at the future as being sort of fraught with trade wars and particularly investment-related wars, and particularly trade and investment that relate to high technology. That is their goal in China, to surpass us in the high-end technology, quantum, AI, a whole range of things, both for economic reasons and for national security reasons. So they're trying to figure out what a new administration would do in that respect. Kamala, they don't really know much about. I'm sure they're scurrying around to figure out, as are many Americans. I think with Trump, they're probably of the view that Trump hasn't necessarily said very much about Taiwan yet. He said they should pay for their own defense, which he has said about NATO countries also. But beyond that, it hasn't been very deep. The thing about this election that plays into the China narrative is it's totally confusing. And we shouldn't forget that one of their major goals internationally is to demonstrate that their system is more stable and more predictable than ours. That democracy, particularly as it's now being practiced in the U.S., is very, very fragmented. It's angry, it's not stable. It leads to things like attempted assassinations, which you don't see in China, confusion, partisan confusion and rancor. And the Chinese are going around to the developing countries saying, our system, which the Americans have been so negative about, is actually more stable, more predictable. You can count on us. Can you count on the Americans? Can you count on the next administration to be your friend, your ally? Can you count on them to build alliances as opposed to undermining them?
Former President Trump has said some pretty remarkable things when it comes to tariffs, for example, on China, including 60%, I think he's talked about. As far as you know, do they take that seriously? Do they think he really is going to impose 60% tariffs, or do they think it's a negotiating ploy?
Well, that's the area where he has talked about China. He hasn't talked about it so much from a strategic point of view, which he has on Ukraine, but from an economic point of view. And I think the answer is they don't really know whether he's simply negotiating with them. He says he's going to raise tariffs for everyone 10%. He's going to raise tariffs on China 60%. At one point he said 100%. I think that they probably think that's a negotiation rather than a reality, because we shouldn't forget we depend on China for a lot of pharmaceuticals. A large portion of the components of American pharmaceuticals come from China. The American farm community depends very heavily on the China market. A lot of American companies depend heavily on the China market. So if the United States does these crazy things like 60% tariffs or these huge increases with great unpredictability, which causes the Chinese to be concerned in itself, then the Chinese, they're not going to sit there stoically. They're going to retaliate. And there are a lot of big clients of Trump and big constituencies of Trump who are going to be extremely unhappy and highly disrupted if we got into a trade war with China, plus all the countries in the neighborhood that are supposed to be our allies will find that highly disruptive.
I'm also so interested to hear your thoughts on the semiconductor industry, because it feels like that's been the arena where a lot of the U.S.-China tensions have been playing out. You think about President Biden's, one of his signature pieces of legislation has been the CHIPS Act, trying to bring more of that chip production back to America. And you think about what the conversations in Beijing might sound when it comes to a potential change in leadership. How much of that conversation do you think is focused on semiconductors?
A lot. The Chinese are heavily dependent on semiconductors. They want to build an industry, but they're still, like we, are heavily dependent on Taiwan semi. And therefore, this is something they have to bear in mind when they think about Taiwan, but they're never going to, at least not in the near term, going to surpass Taiwan. And in the very advanced areas like NVIDIA and many of the other American chip companies, they're not going to be ahead of us anytime soon. So I think the best thing we can do is to, and Vance criticized Taiwan, said they took American business. They didn't take American business. American companies depend on them to make our semiconductors. What we need to do, and even the highest end, so what we need to do if we're going to be serious about competitive wars with China or competitive aspirations vis-a-vis China and theirs vis-a-vis us, is to build a semiconductor industry worthy of the name. It's very small at this point. We design them very well, but we don't make them very much. And the etching is done in the Netherlands anyhow. So we have to really put money in. And the amount, I think Biden's great in terms of putting more money in, but it's nothing compared to the size of these fabs, which are in the multi-billions of dollars. We're just, in the first inning. These Taiwan's been in the game. They've been in the game for decades, and we're going to have to put a lot more money in and train a lot more people in that area. And we're not really looked at by Taiwan as a serious competitor. And China wants to be a serious competitor, both to reduce dependence on the U.S. and to have more leverage over the U.S. and also to be able to be in a position where they don't have to depend as much on Taiwan if they want to take action against Taiwan. But they're not there yet, and they're not going to be for a while.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how that evolves. But I do want to go back to the third plenum, because like you were saying, China, of course, likes to project an image of stability, especially as compared to the U.S. And you think about the third plenum, at least the commentary I've read is that it wasn't too much of a departure from what we've seen already. But what was your takeaway?
That's exactly the right conclusion, that they really are not going to change things very much. The one thing I think, there are two things I think are worth bearing in mind. One of them was not discussed so much in the plenum, the other was, and that is that they used to have a theory of high growth. They were really preoccupied with high growth. They're not as preoccupied anymore, whether they grow at 5% or 4.5%. They like to grow at 5%, but they're not going to put huge amounts of money into highways or bridges, which they did before. The big money, the infrastructure money, so to speak, is going into high technology. That's where the capital is going. The one thing they have to do better is recognize that the most innovative companies in China, not entirely, but for the most part, are private sector companies. They're 60% of Chinese GDP, and they're a huge amount of competitive strength with a lot of innovation. So they're going to have to do more to free them up and give them more opportunities and not lean on them so much. Similarly with the big companies, but they have this notion of control. They don't like these companies that they don't have full control, or at least substantial control over. The other thing is that was not discussed, but it's very important, is that China and Asia are now both playing a much greater role in European strategic and economic issues. China, the Belt and Road is meant to increase trade with Europe. They're playing a greater role, supportive role, not military, but supportive role for Russia in Ukraine. No Asian country has done that since the 1200s with the Mongol Empire. This is the first time. In World War II, Japan's activities were primarily in Asia. Now you see China not only playing a greater role Asia, the first, second, third island chain, building up this circumnavigation of Taiwan with their airplanes. But they're also playing a role in Europe, which Asia has not done in the past. In turn, NATO is now getting a little bit more actively involved in Asia. So this is a wholly different area, and trade is a key element. China wants to trade more with Europe because it's not trading as much as it would like with the U.S. in high technology. And Europe sees China as a big market.
There you go, the Mongol Empire.
No, I mean, it is remarkable to think that Asia has really been out of the European strategic game for 800 years. This is the first time they're back in that game, and we don't know the exact way of measuring it, but they are.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Really wonderful to speak to you. That, of course, is former Undersecretary of State Bob Hormats, as well as Wall Street Week's host David Weston. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get to the trading diary. This is what you need to be watching today and this week. Kamala Harris is set to speak in about 30 minutes time from the White House. We'll bring you that live on Bloomberg Television. You can all see it on the Bloomberg terminal. Type TLIV go. Tomorrow we get big tech earnings from Tesla, which makes that big truck you're looking at there, and Alphabet, the parent of Google. On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses Congress after visiting with President Obama. And on Thursday, we get U.S. GDP and durable goods, followed by PCE inflation data on Friday. And I think it's going to be very interesting to get back to the markets, to get back to earnings after all this political drama.
I mean, you think about big tech earnings, also PCE. These are the types of weeks that normally we live for. But of course, politics has just been taking all the air out of the conversation.
Yeah, let's see if we can finally get back to the numbers. I'm a little doubtful. I think political rhetoric will still steal the show. But you're right, the numbers, if they do disappoint, remember, we are flying near all-time highs after some risk-off mode last week.
Well, and don't forget, Gina Martin-Adams says the rotation is going to happen in earnings, that the S&P 493 are going to start to grow again for the first time in 7 quarters. I'm watching closely for that.
All right, well, we're going to talk about it all tomorrow with our fantastic lineup, headlined by Ann Walsh of Guggenheim. This is Bloomberg.